In a world where assumptions are made without question, one small act of kindness is about to change everything. The sun hung high over the city, casting golden light onto the busy streets. People moved in waves, their hurried footsteps blending into the hum of passing cars and distant sirens. Among the crowd was Malik, a 10-year-old black boy whose presence often went unnoticed. His clothes were worn, his shoes barely holding together, but his spirit remained unbroken. Life had not been kind to him. Homelessness had been his reality for as long as he could remember, and the world had always seemed indifferent to his struggles. Yet, despite everything, Malik carried a heart full of compassion. He navigated the streets with familiarity, dodging passers-by who rarely acknowledged his existence. He had learned long ago that people preferred to look away rather than confront the uncomfortable truth of children like him, children who slept in alleyways, who went to bed hungry, who had no one to call their own. But Malik never let their indifference define him. He still believed in kindness, in doing what was right, even when no one else did. As he made his way toward the corner store, hoping to find something small to eat, a commotion caught his attention. A woman stood outside a cafe, frantically searching her bag, her movements sharp with panic. Her young daughter, no older than 3, stood beside her, clutching a small stuffed rabbit. Tears welled in the child's eyes, her lower lip trembling. Malik slowed his pace, observing the scene. He had seen desperation before, on the faces of people living on the streets, in the eyes of those who had lost everything. The woman's fear was different, but it was real. Then he heard her voice, strained and full of distress. "My wallet." "I had it just a second ago," she muttered, turning in circles, retracing her steps. "I can't find it." "Oh, no, how am I supposed to pay?" People walked past her, some casting quick glances, others pretending not to notice. No one stopped to help. Malik watched as the little girl clung to her mother's leg, her tiny fingers tightening around the fabric. And then, just a few feet away, something caught Malik's eye. A brown leather wallet, slightly worn, lay near the curb where a man had just stepped over it without a second thought. Malik's instincts kicked in immediately. Without hesitation, he darted forward, weaving through the moving crowd. He bent down, snatching the wallet from the pavement before another foot could send it further away. Clutching it tightly, he turned back toward the woman. She was still searching, her panic growing with each passing second. Malik hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. He had been ignored so many times before. He knew that people often didn't trust kids like him, kids who looked like they didn't belong. But this wasn't about him. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, holding up the wallet. His voice was small but steady. "Is this yours?" The woman's head snapped up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a brief second, she seemed to study him, as if trying to determine whether he was to be trusted. Then relief washed over her face. "Oh, my goodness," she breathed, quickly taking the wallet from his hands. She flipped it open, checking the contents before pressing a hand over her heart. "Yes, this is mine. I must have dropped it when I took my phone out. I can't believe you found it." Malik nodded, offering a small smile. "I saw it on the ground and thought it might be yours." Tears shimmered in the woman's eyes as she bent down to his level. "Thank you, sweetheart. You have no idea how much this means to me." The little girl, still clinging to her mother, looked at Malik with wide, curious eyes. Then, without warning, she reached up and offered him her stuffed rabbit, a child's way of showing gratitude. Malik chuckled softly, shaking his head. That's okay. You keep it. Malik had always known that the world saw him differently. His entire life had been a series of closed doors and wary glances, people crossing the street when they saw him coming, store owners watching him too closely when he stepped inside. He had grown used to it, but that didn't mean it hurt any less. At just 10 years old, he had learned that to some people, his dark skin and worn-out clothes were enough to make him a threat. He had spent most of his childhood drifting through the city streets, searching for shelter, for food, for any moment of warmth in a world that often seemed to want nothing to do with him. Malik had no parents to speak of, no home to return to at night. His survival depended on his instincts, and over time he had sharpened them, knowing who to avoid, where to find a safe place to rest, and when to keep his head down. But despite the hardships, Malik refused to let the world's cruelty harden him. He still believed in kindness. He had seen it in the rare stranger who offered him a meal, in the old woman who left food outside her doorstep, pretending it was for the stray cats so he wouldn't feel ashamed to take it. He held on to those moments, believing that goodness still existed, even if it was rare. Not everyone shared that belief. Officer Henderson was one of those people who never looked for kindness in others, especially in kids like Malik. He had been a police officer for years, and his instincts told him that trouble always came in the form of people who looked like Malik. To him, kids like Malik weren't victims of a broken system. They were destined to be criminals. Henderson had a reputation in the neighborhood. He was quick to assume the worst, patrolling the streets with a watchful eye, waiting for someone to make a mistake. He rarely stopped to ask questions, rarely gave anyone the benefit of the doubt. If you were poor, if you looked like you didn't belong, you were guilty until proven innocent. And Malik, with his tattered clothes and empty pockets, fit that description perfectly. The neighborhood itself was split down the middle. There were those who believed that Malik and others like him deserved a chance, a fresh start, a helping hand. People like the cafe owner who let Malik sweep the floors in exchange for a sandwich, or the librarian who let him stay inside a little longer on cold days. They saw him not as a problem, but as a child in need. And then there were those who saw him as nothing more than a nuisance. People who called the police when they saw him resting on a park bench, who whispered about him when he passed by, clutching their belongings a little tighter. They blamed kids like Malik for the crime in the neighborhood, for the things that went wrong, even when he had nothing to do with it. That division shaped the way Malik moved through the world. He always had to be careful, always had to know when to disappear before someone decided he didn't belong. He had learned to read people quickly, to tell from the way they looked at him whether they saw him as human or as something less. The sun blazed high in the sky, drenching the city in golden heat as Malik navigated the crowded streets. It was just another afternoon of wandering, his bare feet moving over the burning pavement, searching for shade, for rest, for something to fill the emptiness in his stomach. Hunger gnawed at him, but he had learned to push it aside. There were bigger worries, like where he would sleep when night came, or whether someone would decide he didn't belong and call the police. The next day was no different. The sun was just as bright, the air thick with the scent of street food and car exhaust. Malik moved through the city like a ghost, unnoticed, unheard, lost in a world that never made space for kids like him. As he passed by a near-empty parking lot, something unusual caught his eye. A car sat idling near the back, its trunk wide open. Malik hesitated, glancing around to see if anyone was nearby. He knew better than to get involved in anything that might draw attention to him. But something didn't feel right. The trunk should have been closed, locked, yet it stood open, as if someone had left in a hurry. His feet moved before he could think twice. Peering inside, he felt his breath catch in his throat. There, wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth, was a baby. The infant's tiny hands curled in the air, her face scrunched as she let out a soft, pitiful whimper. Malik's heart pounded. Who would leave a baby in a trunk? His mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. Was this an accident, a mistake, or something far worse? The baby let out another weak cry, her face turning red with distress. Malik didn't think. He just acted. Carefully, he reached into the trunk, his hands trembling as he lifted the baby into his arms. She was so small, so fragile. She couldn't have been more than a few months old. Her skin was cold to the touch, and Malik instinctively held her closer, trying to offer what little warmth he had. He had no idea what to do next. He needed to find help, but who would believe him? Who would listen? Just as he turned, searching for someone who might know what to do, flashing red and blue lights painted the pavement in front of him. A police cruiser screeched to a stop, and out stepped Officer Henderson. Malik froze. The officer's expression was already set in stone, cold, suspicious, ready to assume the worst. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, his posture rigid with authority. He didn't ask questions. He didn't take a moment to assess the situation. Instead, his voice rang out, sharp and accusing, "Step away from the baby." Malik flinched, instinctively tightening his hold on the child. I found her," he stammered, his voice shaking. "She was in the trunk. Someone left her. Put the baby down now." Officer Henderson barked, cutting him off. His hand twitched toward his belt as if expecting Malik to run. Malik's stomach twisted in fear. He knew that look. He had seen it before, directed at men who looked like him, men who had done nothing wrong but were still treated like criminals. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, suffocating, squeezing the air from his lungs. "I didn't do anything," Malik said, forcing himself to stay calm. "She was alone. I was just trying to help." Officer Henderson's eyes narrowed. He wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind. By now, people had started to gather, drawn by the flashing lights and raised voices. They stood at the edges of the scene, whispering amongst themselves. Some looked at Malik with pity, others with doubt. He could hear the murmurs, the uncertainty in their voices. "Is that kid trying to steal a baby?" someone muttered. "He's homeless, isn't he? Maybe he thought he could take her." Malik's pulse pounded in his ears. This wasn't how this was supposed to go. He had done the right thing. He had tried to help. But no one saw that, not the officer, not the crowd. All they saw was a black boy, standing in the wrong place at the wrong time holding something that wasn't his. Officer Henderson took a step closer. Malik's grip on the baby tightened. He had to make them see. He had to make them listen. But he wasn't sure if they ever would. The tension in the air was suffocating. Malik could feel the weight of the officer's glare pressing down on him, the silent accusations thick between them. The murmurs of the growing crowd only made it worse, their judgment hanging in the air like a storm about to break. His heart pounded as Officer Henderson reached for his handcuffs, his stance rigid, his mind already made up. Just as the officer took a step forward, a piercing scream cut through the chaos. "My baby! Oh my God, my baby!" A woman came barreling through the crowd, her coat flapping behind her, her face twisted in desperation. She was breathless, her frantic eyes darting from face to face until they landed on the infant in Malik's arms. A strangled sob escaped her throat as she surged forward, reaching out as if afraid that what she was seeing wasn't real. Malik barely had time to react before the woman collapsed onto her knees in front of him. Her hands trembled as she touched the baby's tiny fingers, her whole body shaking with relief. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she gasped for breath. "She's mine," she choked out between sobs. "This is my daughter." The entire scene seemed to freeze. The whispers in the crowd silenced, the tension shifting into something entirely different. Officer Henderson, who had been seconds away from arresting Malik, stiffened. His eyes widened slightly, the certainty in his expression crumbling into something much more uncertain. The woman turned her tear-streaked face up to the officer, her voice still shaking. "My car was stolen earlier today," she explained hurriedly. "I went inside for just a second, and when I came out it was gone, with my baby in the back seat." Her voice cracked, the agony of the past hours evident in every word. "I've been searching everywhere. I thought I lost her forever." She turned to Malik then, her eyes locking onto his. There was no hesitation, no doubt. "Did you find her?" she whispered. Malik swallowed hard and nodded. "She was in the trunk," he said quietly. "I heard her crying and—" Before he could finish, the woman pulled him into a tight hug. It caught him off guard. He wasn't used to being embraced, especially not by someone he had just met. For a moment, he didn't know what to do, his arms hovering awkwardly at his sides. But then slowly, he let himself relax into it. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw with emotion. "Thank you for saving my baby." Malik felt something in his chest tighten. He wasn't used to being thanked either. Officer Henderson cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. He looked from the sobbing mother to Malik, his expression faltering. The weight of his mistake settled heavily onto his shoulders. He had been so quick to judge, so quick to assume the worst. In his mind, Malik had been guilty before he even opened his mouth. And now, standing there, watching the mother cling to the boy he had nearly arrested, Henderson felt something unfamiliar: shame. He took a step back, his gaze dropping to the ground. The certainty that had once fueled his authority was now replaced with the undeniable truth. He had been wrong. The crowd, sensing the shift, began murmuring again. This time, their whispers filled with realization rather than suspicion. They had believed what they wanted to believe, just like the officer. They had been so quick to assume that Malik, a homeless black boy, was the villain in this story. But now, faced with the undeniable reality, they had to confront their own biases. Officer Henderson finally looked up, meeting Malik's eyes for the first time, not as a suspect, but as a boy who had done something remarkable. His lips parted as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? Instead, he did something he had never done before. He took a deep breath, straightened his posture, and quietly muttered, "I was wrong." It wasn't much, but to Malik it was everything. The mother, still holding her baby tightly, wiped her tears and looked around. "This boy saved my daughter," she said, her voice firm and unwavering, "and I won't let anyone forget that." Malik, standing in the middle of it all, wasn't sure what to feel. A part of him wanted to run, to disappear, before the world found another reason to turn against him. But another part, the part that had reached for that baby in the first place, stood tall. Because for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just the boy people ignored or feared. For the first time, he was seen. Malik had spent most of his life blending into the background, ignored by those who chose not to see him. He had grown accustomed to being overlooked, judged, before he even had a chance to prove himself. But today, that changed. As he stood in the middle of the once hostile crowd, something was different. People weren't looking past him anymore. They were looking at him with something other than suspicion. The woman whose baby he had saved held her child close, her gratitude written all over her tear-streaked face. The murmurs in the crowd had shifted, turning from accusations into something softer, something closer to admiration. Malik wasn't sure what to do with it. He had spent so long believing that no one would ever see him as anything but trouble. He had stopped expecting kindness, stopped hoping for fairness. But now, as Officer Henderson took a hesitant step forward, his expression weighed down by guilt and regret, Malik realized something had changed, not just for him, but for the people around him. "I was wrong about you," the officer admitted, his voice lower than before. The words were stiff, like they were difficult to say, but they were real. "I should have listened before assuming the worst." Malik stared at him, unsure how to respond. No one had ever admitted they were wrong about him before. No one had ever looked at him with anything close to respect. The mother of the baby turned to the crowd then, her voice firm. "This boy saved my daughter's life," she declared, "and I will never forget that." Malik felt a lump form in his throat. He had never done anything for recognition. He hadn't saved the baby for praise or attention. He had done it because it was the right thing to do, because he knew what it felt like to be alone, to have no one looking out for you. But maybe, just maybe, this moment meant something more. Maybe this was proof that even someone like him, someone the world had written off, could make a difference. News of Malik's heroism spread quickly. What had started as an accusation turned into something far greater. The city took notice. Organizations that had once ignored boys like him suddenly wanted to help. People reached out, offering him resources, shelter, and an education. For the first time in his life, Malik had options. He had a future. But more importantly, he had changed something beyond himself. The people who had watched him with suspicion now questioned their own prejudices. Officer Henderson, a man who had spent years assuming the worst about kids like Malik, had been forced to confront his own biases. The way he policed the neighborhood would never be the same. Malik's story became a lesson, a reminder that assumptions could be wrong, that prejudice had consequences, and that sometimes it only took one act of courage to break down walls that had stood for far too long. In the weeks that followed, Malik found himself in a position he had never imagined, one where people listened to him, where his voice mattered. He didn't just disappear into the background anymore. He had proven that he wasn't invisible, that he wasn't worthless, that he had something to offer the world. He had spent so long believing that people like him weren't meant to be heroes, that kindness was a privilege only certain people could afford. But he had been wrong, because kindness was not about privilege. It was about choice, and Malik had chosen to be kind when no one else would. As he stood at the edge of the city, looking out at the streets he had once called home, he realized that his life had changed forever. He wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time he wasn't afraid of it. Because he knew one thing for certain. Even the smallest acts of compassion had the power to challenge injustice, and even the most overlooked voices had the power to change the world.